I'm Chong-Ming, or CM, and I'm currently an assistant professor at the philosophy department at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore.
Great.
Yeah, so one of my teachers had, informally introduced me to philosophy when I was a student preparing for the GCE A-level examinations. So I think much of this initial encounter with philosophy is not through books, but through conversations. My memory is hazy on this front, so I don't remember much of the conversations, except that they were, often about what I later found out to be themes in existentialism, right? Especially the meaningfulness or perhaps the meaninglessness of our projects, amongst other things. Looking back, much of these discussions, fell squarely in the domain of pop existentialism, as you might have it. Thinking of the cliche image of the chain smoking, berry wearing, wine drinking, emo, as it were, who's entirely self-absorbed in their own suffering. I mean, it kind of fits a certain stage of my life, as a teenager. But in any case, for me, they nonetheless had a fairly profound impact, and I suspect this probably is the case for lots of people who are interested in popular or pop philosophy. Right? I think part of this was to do with the fact that philosophy just wasn't a subject taught in schools in Singapore at the time. It was also very far removed from what I was studying then. So in fact, I was taking papers in biology and chemistry and had planned to be a biochemist, to read biology and chemistry in university. I also didn't grow up in a home environment that valued, I think, reading or questioning. So, in many ways, these discussions were the start of me thinking more deeply about things in general. Then I got hooked. So I soon found that I enjoyed reading philosophy much more than I did the other subjects, and decided on an impulse, right at the end of my GCE A-level examinations, I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna read philosophy in university. Just like I'm just gonna do it. I don't know pretty much anything about this, but I'm gonna do it. And thankfully, more than a decade and a half later, I can still say that okay, I'm still interested. So I feel like I made a good move on that front. Sure. So over the past few years, I've been thinking about various aspects of political resistance, broadly construed. So part of the broader aim is to make sense of what I've been seeing on the news every day, and also in part to try to vindicate some of the actions of those who engage in these kinds of resistance, even if they are considered uncivil or radical. And the attempt is to try to vindicate some of the actions from against what seems to me to be unfair dismissals of their actions. So, for instance, in a recent paper, I argue that it's permissible for activists to vandalize objectionable commemorations. So, such as statues that honor or celebrate colonizers or other people responsible for injustices, given the condition. Given some fairly stringent conditions, right? So if some conditions are met, vandalism could be permissible. And this is kind of in part in response to something that happens a lot in public discourse surrounding these monuments and these commemorations. The idea that vandalism does absolutely nothing. It in fact may make things worse. And in the paper, I argue that no, actually it secures some fairly valuable goods, right? In response to what these objectionable commemorations are doing, right? Both in terms of what they do to our landscape, but also to public narratives about what or who is worth celebrating. And in a forthcoming paper in the Philosopher's Imprint, I explore the question of what activists can target during their acts of resistance. So in public discourse, again, activists are often criticized for directing their acts of resistance against this or that particular target. So for example, people think that it's not okay for activists to harass corrupt politicians at their homes or in restaurants, but that it's generally okay to engage in marches that end up blocking traffic. And I've been thinking a little bit more about this and trying to figure out why exactly is the case that people think it's okay to do this but not okay to do that. Even if the effects of their actions could be very beneficial, right? And it seems like underlying these criticisms, about target selection seems to be this, intuitive judgment that, some targets are legitimate, whereas some targets are just not. And the problem is that this intuitive judgment is rarely articulated and much less often defended. I try to make sense of it, and I argue in the paper that it's most plausibly understood as being undergirded by a deeper concern about how the targets stand in relation to the injustices that the activists purport to be protesting against. But the thing is, once we get there, once we get to the kind of so-called deeper concern, we get some surprising conclusions. Right? So if we're indeed driven by this kind of concern, or this concern in particular, our objections to activists who harass corrupt politicians at restaurants or at their homes cannot be an objection that we make in principle, right? In some circumstances, it may very well be permissible to engage in these kinds of actions. So I mean, going out there and harassing corrupt politicians as they're trying to enjoy their, steak dinner or the like.
Hear more about that, yeah.
Sure. So I think that's certainly, a thought that lots of people have, right? So the idea that, when a politician, regardless of how corrupt they may be, that when they're having dinners at restaurants or resting at home, they're not engaged in the kinds of they're not engaged in creating or sustaining the kinds of problems that activists are protesting against or trying to resist. And I think you're right that some of it can be drawn from discussions in just war theory or ethics in the ethics of defensive harming. The idea that if we were to think of certain kinds of resistance as a kind of defensive action that aims to mitigate or eliminate the injustice, then we should do so when the threat is imminent or when it's ongoing or something like that. But the problem, I guess, the one thing to say, and perhaps this is somewhat flat-footed, is to say that, well, I guess we don't need to take on that particular framing of resistance as defensive in character. Much of it could also be communicative in character. So we secure a range, I think, of political goods, through protest, even if those acts of protest don't do very much work at mitigating or eliminating the injustices that we're trying to address. So there could be, a lot of value in demonstrating that, okay, look, this is a problem, and we're going to hound you to the rest of time, to the end of time, even if it means that we don't do very much in addressing the injustice. Now, the other thing we can say, I think, is that if we take on a broad enough understanding of what is involved in defensive harming, it may very well be the case that we could still think, on the balance of things, that it's permissible to harass these politicians at their homes or in restaurants or the like. And part of this is because, we want to kind of broaden our conception of what it means to participate in the, causal structures or causal networks that are connected to the injustices that they create or they sustain. So insofar as we think that, enjoying a nice, uninterrupted meal at a restaurant or having a nice relaxing time at home could feature in this causal network, they may, I think this will depend a lot on the details, they may also be open to being targeted. And this, kind of mirrors a little bit part of the debates in just war theorizing about whether we can permissibly target non-combatants who provide welfare support for active soldiers, right? So the idea is that you're not out there actively killing enemy combatants or enemy civilians, but you are providing food, shelter, resources, and there's a sense in which, even though you're not directly engaged with the injustices that people may be trying to address, you are nonetheless part of this broader network, right? So in the case of providing welfare support, the connections are much clearer, I think, than having a relaxing time at home or having an uninterrupted meal. But I think a case can be made that even if we're looking at ethics of defensive harming, even if we're trying to extend work in just war theorizing to the context of protest and resistance, I think a case can be made that yeah, we can still, in fact, permissibly target these people at homes and in restaurants, amongst other things. One thing that's I think may be fairly specific to myself, in part due to the way I was brought up, but also maybe in a particular kind of context. So one thing is the importance of overcoming the feeling of shame when you ask people for help. Right? There's a sense that you're imposing on them, you're asking too much of them, even if it's for something relatively trivial. I think like many people, I found the graduate school in philosophy, somewhat lonely and isolating, and spent a lot of time, I think as many people did, trying to work through, a range of philosophical and practical problems on my own, rather than just asking around and talking to people. So I feel like those were, in some ways, wasted years, right? So you spend all those years, worrying about things on your own, and it's just one thing I could tell my younger self, it would be just, well, don't feel ashamed to reach out to people and just ask them for help, and they may be very well happy and to do that, and it's the case for me as well. So when people ask me for help now, these days, I'm very happy to help, and I suspect it probably is the case for a whole bunch of other people too. So yeah.